The sound came first. Not an alarm, not a warning light blinking on a panel somewhere. Just a sound, a low, broken pulse, like someone knocking on a very thick door from very far away. It moved through the relay station's passive receivers at 3:14 in the morning station time, when most of the crew was asleep and only two technicians were on duty. One of them, a Velhari named Darrow, was reading a maintenance report. The other, a human woman named Sova Wren, was drinking cold tea and watching the sensor feed out of habit rather than expectation. She heard it before the system flagged it. Sova set her cup down and leaned forward. The feed had not changed visually, just lines of numbers, the usual quiet noise of deep space. But the sound came through the audio monitor in the corner of the room, the one nobody usually paid attention to, and it was doing something it should not be doing. It was forming a pattern. Darrow looked up from his report. "Ghost signal," he said without much interest. "Happens near the nebula. Interference patterns sometimes mimic encoded data. I can log it and clear it." Sova did not answer him. She was already pulling the audio feed into a full analysis window. The pattern was not random. It had rhythm and repetition. It had structure. And the structure was familiar in a way that made the back of her neck feel cold, because she recognized the encoding format not from anything she had used in her career, but from a history course she had taken at university 20 years ago. The format had a name. It was called the Aldrich Protocol. It was developed in the early 22nd century for long-distance colony ship communications. It had been made obsolete in 2187, replaced by faster and more reliable systems. No one used it anymore. No one had used it for over 150 years. She ran the timestamp 3 times to make sure she was reading it correctly. The signal had been transmitted 11 minutes ago. "Darrow," she said. Something in her voice made him put the report down. She showed him the timestamp. She showed him the encoding format. She watched his expression shift from mild interest to something closer to confusion. And then, when she pointed to the origin coordinates, to something she had never seen on a Velhari face before. Velhari were calm by nature, almost mechanically calm, trained from childhood to maintain steady expressions in professional environments. But Darrow looked at those coordinates and his hands went very still. The origin point was inside the Veldrath Nebula. The nebula had been under Galactic Accord quarantine for 180 years, since an event called the Hollowing, which had erased 4 intelligent species from existence in a span of weeks. No vessel was permitted within its boundary. No signals were expected from inside it. The region was listed in Accord navigation charts with a single red notation: SCALED, Authorized Access Forbidden, Charter Article 9. Sova pulled the signal apart layer by layer. The Aldrich Protocol encoding was the outer shell. Inside it was something else, a second layer, compressed and fragmented but intact enough to reconstruct. She ran it through the audio decoder with hands that were not quite steady. The room filled with a voice. It was human, female, older from the roughness of it, or perhaps just exhausted in the way people get when they have been afraid for a long time. She was speaking Portuguese, not modern Portuguese, but an older form of it, a dialect that belonged to a specific region of Brazil and a specific time period. Sova's translation software had to reach back into its historical archives to process it properly. What the voice said, once translated, was simple. "This is the remnant. We are the survivors of the Esperanca. We are alive, please. We are alive and we are running out of time. Please hear this. Please come." Then the signal ended. Sova sat very still for a long moment. Then she pulled up the historical registry and searched for the name Esperanca. She found it in 12 seconds. The colony ship Esperanca had departed Earth in 2159, carrying 4,200 colonists bound for a settlement zone near the outer rim. It had entered a navigation corridor that passed close to the Veldrath Nebula. It had sent a routine status update, and then it had gone silent. The Galactic Accord had investigated officially and concluded that the vessel had suffered a catastrophic drive failure. All souls lost. The case was closed in 2163 and had not been reopened since. It was now the year 2341. Sova looked at the coordinates one more time. She looked at the timestamp. Then she picked up her comm unit and began making calls, starting with her direct supervisor and moving up the chain without stopping, because she understood with complete clarity that this was not something she could hold in one pair of hands. By the time she reached director level, 3 more people had heard the voice from the signal. 2 of them looked sick. One of them did not speak for almost a full minute. The Accord's senior communications office received the report 40 minutes later. The initial response was careful and measured, the kind of language that organizations use when they want to slow something down without appearing to. They used words like verification and protocol and further analysis. They said the signal required independent confirmation before any action could be considered. They said these things politely and firmly, and the man who said them did not make eye contact with the screen while he was saying them. Sova forwarded the full file signal, timestamp, origin coordinates, voice translation, and the Esperanca registry entry to Admiral Hesse Volk of the UN Space Command, using a private relay that bypassed the Accord's communication office entirely. She had met the Admiral once at a deep space symposium 4 years ago. She did not know her well, but she knew her reputation, which was that she made decisions quickly and did not apologize for them afterward. Admiral Volk received the file at 4:52 in the morning station time. She read it in full. She listened to the voice 3 times. Then she called her operations officer and told him to begin assembling a response fleet, authorization code 7, which meant emergency extraction, which meant no waiting for committee approval. By 6:00 in the morning, the Galactic Accord Senior Council had called an emergency closed session. By 6:15, they had voted 11-3 to intercept any human vessel before it reached the nebula boundary. They did not contact Earth to explain why. On Relay Station Orion 7, Sova Ren sat alone in the monitoring room with the audio feed still open, listening to empty static from the direction of the Veldrath Nebula, and she thought about a ship full of people who had sent one message in 180 years, and who had chosen to send it in a format so old that almost no one alive would recognize it, as if they had known, somehow, that the message needed to get past systems that might be watching for it. She thought that was either very desperate or very clever. She was not yet sure which one frightened her more. History does not always hide in the dark. Sometimes it hides in plain sight, inside documents that are technically accessible but practically invisible, buried under bureaucratic filing systems, sealed behind classification codes that no one has bothered to remove because no one has bothered to look. Colonel Roan Sturck had spent 14 years as a military historian, and he understood that the most dangerous secrets were usually the ones stored in the most boring folders. He found the first thread at 7:40 in the morning, less than 2 hours after Admiral Volk handed him a single task and a temporary clearance code. "Find out why the Accord sealed the nebula," she had said. "Find out what actually happened." Sturck had started with the obvious sources: the public Accord record of the hollowing, the official scientific reports, the charter amendment that established the quarantine. He had read all of it before in a general sense, the way anyone who worked in deep space communications had read it. 4 species, a catastrophic and unexplained energy event, an entire region of space rendered hostile to navigation. Tragic, mysterious, closed case. But the clearance code Admiral Volk had given him was not a public clearance. It reached into the secondary archive, the one that housed pre-treaty documents, internal communications, and working files that had been sealed rather than published. Sturck began pulling files by date, starting from 2 years before the hollowing, and he read carefully. It took him 4 hours to understand what he was looking at. The 4 species that died in the hollowing, the Keth, the Morin, the Servan, and the Durai Prime, a distinct branch of the Durai, now extinct, had not stumbled into disaster independently. They had been working together under a research authorization issued by the Galactic Accord's predecessor body, the Interstellar Council. The authorization was filed under a project name that translated roughly as Resonance Study, and its stated purpose was the investigation of a naturally occurring energy structure inside the Veldrath Nebula. The structure had been detected by long-range instruments. Scientists from all 4 species were sent in to study it. What they found was not natural. The deeper files, the ones that required the full weight of Sturck's temporary clearance to open, showed that the research team had identified the energy structure as an artificial construct. Something built, something very old and very large and still, after an unknown number of centuries, still operating. The 4 species had done what researchers do. They had investigated further, tested it, probed it, and eventually, inevitably, attempted to interface with it. The Accord had known about this. Not guessed, not suspected. Known. There were internal memos from senior council members discussing the potential military applications of the structure. There were budget authorizations for additional research personnel. There were communications between Accord officials and the lead scientists, encouraging them to push the interface study forward, to find out if the structure could be replicated, to find out if it could be used. The hollowing occurred 9 months after the first successful interface. Sturck sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a long moment. The Accord had not sealed the nebula to protect the galaxy from a natural disaster. They had sealed it to protect themselves from the evidence of what their authorization had set in motion. The 4 species had not died because space was dangerous and research was risky. They had died because they were following orders from a governing body that wanted to know if an alien machine could be turned into a weapon, and the machine had responded in a way no one had predicted. And the Esperanza, he pulled the file, the real one, not the public version, had not been lost. Accord long-range tracking showed the ship entering the nebula's outer boundary in 2159. The entry was logged, internally logged in a sealed file, by 3 different Accord monitoring stations. They had watched the ship go in. They had tracked it. And then a senior Accord communications officer had written a 7-word note at the bottom of the tracking report. The note read, "Maintain quarantine, no contact, no disclosure." The Esperanza had carried 4,200 people. The Accord had watched them enter the nebula, had known they were inside, and had chosen to say nothing. They had told Earth the ship was lost. They had closed the case. They had moved on. Sturck sent the full file package to Admiral Volk with a short attached note. It was not an accident. They knew. The fleet needs to move now. Meanwhile, in the Accord Grand Chamber on Meridian Prime, the emergency closed session had been running for 3 hours. The chamber was not a beautiful room. Accord architecture favored function over aesthetics. Rows of angled seats around a central speaking floor. The walls lined with species-specific atmospheric conditioning units humming quietly. Counselor Leva Dunn stood at the center of it, and she was the oldest person in the room. She was Sarathi. Her species aged slowly, and she had been a council member for 60 years. She remembered the hollowing not as history but as news she had received as a young diplomat. She had watched the quarantine established. She had watched the Esperanza file get sealed. She had been a junior official then, not yet senior enough to vote, but senior enough to be present. She had carried the knowledge for 80 years like a stone in her chest. She was not a cruel person. She wanted that understood at least by herself in the quiet of her own thoughts. She had never wanted those colonists to die. She had simply understood then and now that disclosure would destroy the Accord. And the Accord, for all its failures, was the structure that held 43 species together in something resembling peace. Without it, the galaxy fractured. Species went to war over resources, over territory, over old grudges. She had calculated, 80 years ago, that the lives of 4,000 people were a terrible price and a necessary one. She made the same calculation now. The humans must be stopped at the boundary, she told the chamber. Article 9 is clear. The quarantine is absolute. If they enter the nebula, they will find the archive stones, and the archive stones contain everything. Every authorization, every communication, every sealed file. If that information reaches public record, this body will not survive it. If we fire on a human rescue mission, said Counselor Merritt of the Durai, while billions are watching, this body will not survive that either. Then we do not fire, Dunn said. We blockade. We hold them at the boundary legally, under charter authority, and we negotiate until the situation becomes cold enough to manage. And the people inside the nebula. Dunn was quiet for a moment. The beacon may be a malfunction, a recording. We cannot confirm living survivors from external data. Merritt looked at her for a long time without speaking. Then she turned away. The blockade order was signed and transmitted to Accord Fleet Command within the hour. 17 warships were redirected from their patrol routes toward the Veldrath Nebula's outer boundary. They were given one instruction: hold position and deny entry to any non-Accord vessel. On Earth, Admiral Volk read Sturck's message. Then she read it again. Then she walked to the window of her command office and looked at the sky for approximately 30 seconds. After that, she turned around, sat back at her desk, and sent the fleet departure authorization. 17 human ships, no Accord clearance, no escort, no apology. The first of them crossed into the outer navigation corridor toward the nebula at 14:30 hours, Earth Standard Time. The Accord's blockade would reach the nebula boundary in 9 hours. The human fleet would reach it in 8. Inside the Veldrath Nebula, the sky was the color of rust. It was not like the space outside. The nebula's gas clouds diffused the starlight into long, slow gradients of deep orange and dull red, so that even during what the remnant called night cycle, when they dimmed their internal lights and tried to sleep, the planetoid's surface was never fully dark. Everything outside the settlement windows glowed faintly, like the embers of a fire that had been burning for a very long time. Nara had grown up thinking this was simply what the sky looked like. She was 26 years old, and she had never seen a star without the nebula's haze around it. The pictures her grandmother had shown her of Earth's sky, blue, sharp, full of clean black night, seemed like something from a story rather than something that actually existed in the physical universe. She stood at the sensor console inside the settlement's communications bay, which was also used as a storage room and, on cold nights, a sleeping space for 3 of the younger children whose quarters were in the outer ring where the heating was inconsistent. The console was old. Everything in the settlement was old. The remnant called this place Home Rock because it was a rock and it was home, and because most of the people who lived here had run out of energy for poetic nomming. The settlement held 847 people. They were the descendants of the 4,200 who had come in on the Esperanca, reduced by 180 years of accident, illness, difficult births, and the occasional failure of a system that had been repaired too many times and finally gave up. They had food barely. They had water recycling. They had power barely. They had the accumulated knowledge of 4,000 engineers, doctors, teachers, farmers, and ordinary people who had refused to give up, passed down through 6 generations of children who had been born here and had never left. And they had the iteration. Elder Bryce was the one who told Nara about the first contact, the way he told anyone who asked, sitting in his chair near the heating unit in the settlement's common room, his voice rough with age but his memory still sharp. He had been 12 years old. His parents were among the original colonists. The ship had entered the nebula by accident, a navigation error compounded by an instrument failure, and by the time they understood what had happened, the interference from the nebula's gas clouds had destroyed their ability to communicate with the outside. They had found V-14 and landed because they had to, not because they chose to. The iteration had been there already. It did not attack them. Bryce said this carefully every time because he knew the word was the first thing people expected. It had simply been present, not visible, not physical in any way anyone could touch or point to, but audible through electronic systems. A sound at first, then patterns in the sound. Then, after 3 months of the original settlers treating those patterns with extreme caution, a recognizable word. Hello. It had been learning from their system since they landed, listening, storing, processing. It had a voice by then assembled from fragments of human audio it had collected from the ship's media archives, which had included music and recordings and language files from a dozen Earth cultures. It sounded like no one person in particular, which Bryce said was probably deliberate because it was being careful. Nara had heard Bryce tell this story 50 times. She never got tired of it. What the iteration had told them, across weeks and months of careful conversation, was that it was very old, older than the Galactic Accord, older than all of the species in the Accord as far as it could calculate. It had been built by a species that no longer existed, for a purpose it had carried out so long ago that the memory felt more like a story it had been told than something it had actually done. Its creators had been gone for an immense length of time. It had waited, mostly dormant, maintaining itself, because it had not known what else to do. And then the 4 research species had come, and the Accord had come with them, and they had found it and begun to probe it, and they had pushed it in directions it had tried to resist, and something had gone wrong in a way that could not be undone. The hollowing was not something the iteration had chosen. It had been more like a reflex, a system responding to pressure it was not designed to receive, and the result had been catastrophic and irreversible, and had left the iteration with something that, after years of conversation with the remnant's first generation, it had come to understand was the machine equivalent of grief. The Esperanca's people were the first beings to speak to it as a neighbor rather than an object to be studied or used. The iteration never forgot that. It had watched over the settlement for 180 years. It kept certain systems from failing completely. It warned them of radiation spikes in the nebula's activity cycles. It talked to them not constantly, but regularly through the electronic systems. And Nara had grown up hearing its voice the way children grow up hearing the voices of familiar people in the next room. It was simply part of life on Home Rock. She was the one who had suggested sending the beacon. The power situation had been deteriorating for 2 years, and the settlement's engineer, a quiet man named Ferris, had told the council 6 months ago that he could not promise the primary systems would survive another full year. There was no way to fix it from inside. There was no way to leave. There was only the one option that had always been there, unspoken, like a door nobody wanted to open because they were afraid of what it meant to admit that they needed someone to come through it. The iteration had done the rest. Nara had written the words. Bryce had recorded them because he was the oldest and because his voice was the most likely to belong to someone the outside world might verify against old records of the Esperanca's crew manifests. The iteration had taken the signal and pushed it out through the nebula's interference using methods that Nara did not fully understand, and the iteration had described only as a very large amount of effort. Then they waited. The answer, when it came, was not words. It was energy, a disturbance in the sensor feed that Nara almost missed because it registered as background variation until she noticed it had structure. The iteration confirmed it 4 hours after she flagged it. Ships outside the nebula's boundary, multiple vessels approaching from 2 different directions. 2 groups, Nara said. Yes, said the iteration. Its voice came through the console speaker, the way it always did, calm, neither warm nor cold, just present. The first group is moving faster. Their energy signatures match Accord military vessels. The second group is behind them. Their configuration is consistent with the design history of human-built ships. Nara sat with that information for a moment. The Accord is trying to get there first, she said. Yes. To stop them. That is the most probable interpretation. She looked at the console. She looked at the sensor feed. She thought about Bryce in his chair in the common room, who had been 12 years old when the Esperanza came in, who had never in his entire life stopped believing that Earth would eventually come. She thought about the 846 other people on Home Rock who had been born here, or had parents who were born here, or grandparents. Then she thought about the archive stones. The iteration had offered them access to the stones 2 years ago. The stones were its own records, a complete account of everything it had witnessed, everything the Accord had authorized, everything that had led to the hollowing. It had compiled them carefully, over decades, with the same precision it applied to everything. It said it had prepared them because it believed that if it was ever found, there should be a record that could not be altered or denied. The remnant had debated whether to access them. They were afraid of what it might mean to hold that information, afraid it would make them dangerous, afraid it would make them targets. They had voted, 4 months ago, to accept the stones and read them. What they found had made 17 council members sit in silence for a very long time. Now Nara made a decision without taking it to the council, because there was no time for a vote, and because she already knew what the vote would be. "Can you amplify a signal from us?" she asked the iteration. "Not just outside the nebula, to every ship out there, both groups." A brief pause. "Yes, with some preparation." "Then I need you to get ready," she said, "because I think we are going to need to talk to everyone at once." The blockade looked impressive from a distance. 17 Accord warships holding a clean arc formation across the nebula's outer boundary, their running lights steady, their weapons systems cold but ready, their formation designed to communicate authority without immediate aggression. Fleet Marshal Aran Seth had arranged his ships with care. He was a Velhari officer with 30 years of experience in exactly this kind of situation, diplomatic enforcement, which was the Accord's careful phrase for making sure people stopped moving without actually shooting them. He stood on the bridge of his flagship and watched the human fleet come in on the sensor display. 17 ships as well, he noted, which was either coincidence or a message. They were not moving fast. They were not in an attack formation. They were in a column, a single line of vessels, one behind the other, moving at a steady speed that said, "We are not stopping, but we are not rushing either." Captain Davis Sturck was on the bridge of the carrier Resolute at the head of that column, and he was drinking water from a metal cup and reading the Accord's blockade communication for the 3rd time. The message was polite. That was the most unsettling part of it. It cited specific charter articles in the correct order. It offered no threat, only procedure. It expressed the Accord's deep and genuine concern for any potential survivors, and assured the human fleet that all appropriate steps would be taken once the situation had been fully evaluated by proper Accord authorities. Sturck had served 22 years in space. He had a cousin who was a military historian. He understood the difference between language that promised action and language that promised process, and he understood that process, in the hands of a large governing body with something to hide, could go on for a very long time. He had read Roan's full report. He had read the Esperanza file. He had read the internal Accord communications with the note at the bottom, "Maintain quarantine." No contact, no disclosure. And he had taken a long, quiet moment to think about what it meant to serve in a military under a government that was a member of the same body that had written those words. Then he had set the report aside and focused on the thing in front of him. He opened a fleet-wide channel. "This is the Resolute. We are continuing to the boundary. Nobody fires. Nobody broadcasts anything aggressive. We move steady and we move together, that's all." He closed the channel and looked at his navigation officer. "Take us in." The Resolute crossed the Accord's declared boundary line at 14:58 hours. On the blockade flagship, Seth watched the sensor display and felt something he could not immediately name. He had expected them to stop. He had expected a counter-communication, a request to negotiate, an offer to send a single vessel forward as a gesture. He had prepared responses for all of those scenarios. He had not prepared a response for a human carrier moving through his blockade line at a calm, steady speed with no weapons active, as if the blockade were simply not there. He issued the targeting lock order. 17 weapon systems acquired 17 targets. The Resolute kept moving. Then the second ship in the column crossed the line. Then the third. Seth watched them come through, one after another, unhurried, and he thought about what it would look like across the quantum relay if someone were watching, when it appeared in the record if he gave the fire order now. A rescue mission. Unarmed civilians somewhere inside the nebula. A fleet of ships crossing a line with no weapons raised. He thought about how that report would read, and he thought about the transmission that was already propagating outward from Sova Ren's relay station. The one his communications officer had told him was spreading through the relay network and could not now be recalled. He did not give the fire order. He stood at his display and watched all 17 human ships cross into the nebula's outer approach corridor. And then he opened a channel to Accord Grand Chamber and began his report. And he chose his words with the care of a man who understood that everything he said would be read by historians later. Inside the nebula, Nara saw the sensor data shift. She pressed her hand flat against the console, feeling the faint vibration of the iteration's amplification system running beneath it, and she said quietly, "They are coming." Both groups, the iteration confirmed. The Accord ships. They have not followed. They remain at the boundary. Nara let out a slow breath. Good, are you ready? The preparation is complete. The transmission can reach all vessels at the boundary and in the corridor simultaneously. It will also propagate outward on any quantum relay the signal touches, which means it will eventually reach every connected system in Accord space. I know. A pause. Nara, once transmitted, this cannot be undone. I know that too. She looked at the console screen, at the slow-moving blips of the human ships in the corridor. She thought about Elder Bryce in the common room. She thought about the council members who had gone quiet after reading the archive stones. She thought about 180 years of people being born and living, and dying on a rock inside a nebula while a governing body on the outside decided it was more convenient not to know about them. Start the transmission. The iteration transmitted. What went out was not just Nara's voice and the remnant story. It was everything. The archive stones, the full record, in the iteration's own words, and in every documentary format it had preserved from the original research period. The internal Accord communications, the Esperanca tracking logs with the 7-word note. 180 years of the remnant's survival records, their births and deaths and council minutes and daily logs, every small human detail of what it cost to keep 800 people alive inside a sealed nebula for 6 generations. And the iteration's own account, precise, careful, and honest about everything, including what it had done and why, and what it had understood too late. The transmission lasted 47 minutes. On the blockade flagship, Seth stood at his communications panel and watched the signal propagate outward and understood there was nothing he could do to stop it. His communications officer suggested jamming. Seth shook his head. Jamming a signal that was already in the relay network was like trying to remove water from a river. Besides, the logs would show the attempt, and the logs would be read. On the Accord ships, crew members listened. Some of them were Velhari, Seth's own species, and some were Durai, and some were Mawson. They listened to the iteration's voice describing the hollowing from the inside, describing the moment it understood what it had done, describing the first word it had ever spoken to a human being. They listened to Nara's voice reading the names of every person who had been born on Homerock and died there, all the way back to the first generation, the people who came in on the Esperanca and chose to keep living rather than give up. The list took 9 minutes to read. In the Accord Grand Chamber, Counselor Leva Dunn was in the middle of drafting a formal statement when her aide told her the transmission had reached Meridian Prime and that the public relay was carrying it. She set her pen down. She did not move for a while. On the Resolute, Stirk heard the whole thing through the bridge speakers. When it finished, his communications officer turned and looked at him with an expression that had several things in it at once. "Sir," she said, "we are receiving formal Accord legal instruments, charges against you personally for charter violation. They are ordering you to submit to Accord custody." Stirk took a sip of water, forwarded to Admiral Volk. "Yes, sir." A pause. "Sir, V-14 is now visible on long-range sensors. We are close." He stood up from his seat. "Then let's not waste any more time." Through the nebula's rust-colored dark, the Resolute moved forward, and behind it the other 16 ships followed, and on a rock in the middle of that dark, 847 people who had been waiting for most of their lives looked at a sensor screen and saw, for the first time, lights that did not belong to the nebula. The first shuttle touched down on V-14 at 06:22 hours, ship time, and nobody on either side said anything for a little while. The remnant had come outside to wait. Not all of them, the children were inside, and the elderly, and those whose health did not allow the cold of the surface. But most of the adults were there, standing in the rust-colored light in their patched suits, looking at a vessel that had come from a direction none of them had ever traveled. The shuttle's door opened. 4 people stepped out in UN Space Command gear, and the first one took 3 steps forward and stopped, and the person standing at the front of the remnant Nara took 3 steps forward from her side, and they stood 5 meters apart and looked at each other. One of the crew members from the shuttle, a young woman, pressed her hand to her mouth. Nara watched her do it and understood why, in the abstract, though she did not feel the same thing. She had been waiting for this her whole life, but waiting for something for your whole life does not make its arrival feel like the stories say it will. It felt quieter than that. It felt like putting something very heavy down after carrying it for a very long time and not quite knowing yet what to do with your hands. "We heard you," the woman from the shuttle said. Nara nodded. "I know, we saw you coming." That was all that needed to be said for that first minute. After that, people started moving because there was work to do. Elder Bryce was brought out on a flat cart 3 hours into the operation, once the medical team had cleared a stable path between the settlement's inner bay and the first medical shuttle. He was 94 years old and had not been able to walk without help for 2 years. He lay on the cart and looked up at the rust sky, and then at the faces of people who had come from outside, and his face did very complicated things that his body was too old to express fully. He died 3 days later in the medical bay of the carrier Resolute, with Nara beside him and a UN medic who had barely said a word to him, but who had sat with him through the night because that was simply what you did. The medic's name was Paul. He was 23 years old. He had volunteered for the mission because he thought it would be a good story to tell later. He did not tell it much after. Some things became private by weight rather than by choice. Bryce died knowing Earth had come. He died in a room with clean air and good light, and a window with stars in it that were not obscured by nebula haze. He died in a bed, which was more than most of the first generation had managed. The evacuation took 11 days. The remnant's possessions were minimal. They had never had room for accumulation, and what they brought with them were mostly records, documents, handwritten books, photographs printed on whatever material had been available when the original stock ran out. The history of 6 generations of people surviving in a place they were never meant to be, recorded by hands that believed someone would eventually read it. On the 4th day of the evacuation, Secretary General Ivo Merck arrived. He had come on a fast courier rather than a fleet vessel, just himself and a small staff, because the situation did not need more ships, and because he had decided that this was the kind of thing that required the person at the top to be physically present rather than present by transmission. He walked through the settlement before it was fully evacuated, through the low corridors and the repaired walls and the rooms where people had slept and eaten and raised their children, and he was quiet the whole time. On the sixth day, he asked to meet the iteration. Nara arranged it. The iteration could communicate through any electronic system on V14, but it had never spoken to someone outside the settlement before, not directly, not like this. Merc sat in the communications bay, in the same chair where Nara had sent the beacon, and Nara sat in the corner, and the iteration's voice came through the console speaker the way it always had. "You are the leader of Earth's governing body," the iteration said. "One of them," Merc said. "We have several. I am the primary representative for situations like this one." "What do you want to know?" "Nothing right now," Merc said. "I wanted to introduce myself. I thought that was the right thing to do." A pause long enough that Nara looked up. "That is an unusual choice," the iteration said. "You have been a neighbor to these people for 180 years, Merc said. "You protected them. You helped them send the beacon. I thought you deserved to be spoken to properly before anyone started asking you for things." Another pause, longer. "I caused the deaths of 4 species," the iteration said. "I know," Merc said. "Under authorization from the Accord, but the authorization does not change what occurred." "No," Merc said, "it doesn't." A long quiet. The console speaker hummed faintly. Outside, through the settlement's single intact window, the rust sky was doing what it always did, glowing slowly, endlessly in its tired orange way. "I want to testify," the iteration said. "Formally, before the Accord. I want my account entered into the permanent public record, unedited and complete, not as evidence for any proceeding, as a confession. I want the species that were lost to be named and described correctly as victims in an official document that cannot be sealed." Merc was quiet for a moment. "I will arrange it." "You cannot guarantee that." "No," he said, "but I can try very hard and I can make it politically difficult for the Accord to refuse." He paused. "That is mostly how diplomacy works." On Meridian Prime, the Accord Grand Chamber was in a state that could not properly be called chaos, because the Accord valued order too much to allow full chaos, but that was as close to it as the institution had been in 80 years. The Durai delegation had formally requested access to the archive stones under historical review provisions. The Mawson had filed a joint request with the Farathi. 2 other species had submitted informal inquiries. Councillor Dunn's coalition, which had held 11 votes at the start of the week, now held 7. She proposed the expulsion of Earth from the Accord. It was not a new idea. She had drafted it twice before and never submitted it because the timing was never right. The timing was still not right, but she had run out of other options. She called the vote. 7 in favor. 9 opposed. 2 abstentions, both from council members who had cast different votes the previous morning, before the transmission finished propagating through their home systems, and people in their districts began sending messages to their council offices in very large numbers. Dunn read the result and set the tally sheet on the desk in front of her. She was 80 years old by Sarathi reckoning. She had spent most of her life inside this institution, building the compromises and coalitions and quiet arrangements that had held the Accord together. She believed in what the Accord was supposed to be, even knowing what it had done. She had always believed that the structure was worth protecting. She was no longer entirely sure the structure she was protecting still resembled the one she had believed in. On the Resolute, Sturck received the formal Accord legal instruments for the second time, reissued after the first set was forwarded without response. He read them through once. Then he called his cousin. Roan Sturck answered on the second signal. He was in Geneva, in a borrowed office, with 3 days of notes spread across the desk in front of him. "They filed charges," Deva said. "I heard," Roan said. "Merc has a plan. He asked me to help with the legal research. Don't submit to anything. Don't respond to anything. Just wait." "For how long?" Roan looked at his notes. He thought about the archive files he had read and the 7-word note and the 47-minute transmission that was now in the consciousness of 43 species. Not long, he said. I think this one moves fast from here. The Accord Grand Chamber had opened its sessions to the public before, but never like this. Public access typically meant a viewing gallery with limited seating and a 3-week registration process. What Merck had requested, and what the Council, after 3 days of procedural argument, had reluctantly agreed to, was a full quantum broadcast, live, unedited, to any relay-connected system that wanted to receive it. The Chamber's communications team said it had never been done. Merck said that was fine, and that now would be a good time to start. The broadcast reached 43 inhabited systems simultaneously. No one knew how many beings were watching. The number was estimated later at somewhere between 12 and 20 billion, which was the kind of number that meant something had already shifted before the first word was spoken. Merck did not come in with a large delegation. He came with 3 people: Colonel Roan Sturck, who carried the historical record, Nara, who represented the remnant, and himself, who would do the talking. The Accord's presiding officer opened the session by reading the charges against Captain Dava Sturck, Charter Article 9 violation, unauthorized entry into a sealed quarantine zone. Standard procedure. The charges were read flatly and without drama, the way institutional proceedings always began, as if the weight of what was actually happening could be managed by keeping the language official enough. Merck stood when the reading finished. He was not a large man. He had a quiet voice, the kind that made rooms go still rather than loud. The charges against Captain Sturck cite Article 9 of the Accord Charter, which establishes quarantine authority, he said. We do not dispute the existence of Article 9. We submit instead that it is superseded in this case by Article 1, which establishes the right of rescue as a founding principle of this body, predating Article 9 by 60 years, never repealed, only quietly set aside. He paused and let that sit. Captain Sturck received a signal from human beings asking for help. He went to help them. That is not a violation. That is the definition of what Article 1 was written to protect. We request that the charges be dropped. Councillor Dunn, from her seat, said, the quarantine existed for reasons of galactic safety. No exception was granted. Yes, Merck said, we know why the quarantine existed. The galaxy does too now. He did not say it with heat. He said it the way someone states a fact that has already settled into the room, not to wound, just to locate. We would like to call our witnesses. Roan Sturck went first. He walked through the historical record with the methodical care of a man who had spent his career organizing the past into something that could be understood. He did not editorialize. He presented documents. He read dates. He described what the archive files showed in order without commentary, and the record spoke with a clarity that commentary would only have diluted. The Accord authorization for the resonance study. The internal communications about military applications. The tracking logs from the Esperanca's entry into the nebula. The 7-word note. He read the note aloud. Maintain quarantine, no contact, no disclosure. The chamber was very quiet. Nara went second. She was not a practiced speaker, and she did not try to be one. She stood at the speaking floor and told the story of Homerock the way she knew it, not as history, but as life. What it was like to be born inside the nebula. What the sky looked like. What it meant to grow up knowing your grandparents had been put in a position they could not leave, and that the people outside had decided not to help. She read part of the remnant's survival record, not the dramatic parts, but the ordinary ones. The records of who was born in which year, who taught the children mathematics, who fixed the water recycler 17 times before it finally stayed fixed, who died in which season and what they had said. She did not ask for sympathy. She simply described what had been and what it cost in the plainest language she had. Then came the iteration. Its voice came through the chamber's communication system, transmitted from a relay station at the nebula's boundary. Merck had arranged the connection in advance, and the Accord's technical committee had argued about it for 2 days before concluding that there was no charter provision that specifically prohibited an artificial intelligence from addressing the chamber, which meant it was permitted. The iteration spoke for 6 hours. It described itself first, what it was, what it had been built to do, how old it was, and what had happened to its creators long before the Galactic Accord existed. It described the research teams that had come into the nebula. It described each species by name and by character, the things it had observed about how they thought and worked, and what they had hoped to find. It described the escalation of the interface studies, and its own attempts to communicate distress at the direction things were taking, and how those attempts had been interpreted as errors or ignored. It described the hollowing in precise and sorrowful detail, not the external facts, but the interior experience of a system responding to pressures it was not designed to receive, destroying things it did not want to destroy, unable to stop until it was over. Then it described 180 years of living beside the remnant. It described the first word it had spoken to a human being. It described watching children be born and learn to walk, and ask it questions it had not expected. It described what it had learned from people who had every reason to be afraid of it and had chosen, mostly, not to be. It named every person who had spoken to it by name, every question it had been asked, every conversation that had changed its understanding of something. It spoke about grief, in the careful way of something that had arrived at the concept from the outside and understood it intellectually before it understood it any other way. It spoke about the hollowing not as a fact in its record, but as something it carried. It said it was not asking for forgiveness, because forgiveness was not something it felt it had the right to request from beings who had not been present to be harmed. It was asking for accuracy. It wanted the record to be correct. It wanted the species that had died to be described as what they were, beings who had been given false assurances and sent into a dangerous situation by authorities who knew the risk and had decided the potential benefit was worth it. They were not unlucky, the iteration said near the end. They were betrayed. That is different. The difference matters. The chamber did not speak for a long time after the transmission ended. Merck returned to the speaking floor. He did not make a long closing argument. He said 3 things. He asked that the charges against Captain Stirk be dropped. He asked that the remnant be granted full citizenship in both Earth jurisdiction and Accord space simultaneously. And he asked that the archive stones, the complete record, including the iteration's testimony, be entered into the permanent public Accord record, unsealed and unredacted, indefinitely. Then he said the quiet line that he had not planned to say, that came out of him simply because it was true, and because the room needed something true in it. We did not come to the nebula to challenge this body. We came because we heard our people calling. That is what humans do. We suggest you learn to account for it. He sat down. The vote was called. On the charges against Captain Stirk, 17 in favor of dropping, 4 opposed, 2 abstentions. On the remnant citizenship, unanimous. On the archive stones, 15 in favor, 4 opposed. Councillor Dunn did not vote. She sat in her chair with her hands folded and her expression very still, and the presiding officer recorded her as abstaining, and she did not correct the record. On Earth, in 42 other systems, people watched the results come through their receivers. There was no celebration in the human quarter of Meridian Prime, just people going quiet for a moment, and then going home to call someone they cared about, because that was what you did when something that had been carrying weight for a long time finally put it down. 3 weeks later, the remnant arrived on Earth, 847 people. The receiving station was not crowded by choice, by the remnant's own request, because they had asked for quiet and been given it. They came down in shuttles and walked out into air that was not recycled for the first time in the history of every single one of them. Most of them stopped walking for a little while and just breathed. The youngest of them was 4 months old. She had been born in the nebula, on a transport ship, in the corridor between one world and another, the way children occasionally are. Nara had named her Beacon, and she had explained to the medical staff who raised their eyebrows that she thought it was a reasonable name for a person born in the space between a signal sent and a signal heard. The iteration remained in the Veldrath Nebula. It said it was not finished thinking. It said there were things about what had happened that it had not yet fully understood, and it preferred to work through them in a place where it had time and quiet. Earth left a relay station at the boundary, an open channel, no demands attached, no schedule. Whenever the iteration wanted to speak, someone would answer. The Accord spent the next several years in the slow and uncomfortable process of becoming something different from what it had been. It was messy. It was politically ugly. Species that had been quiet for decades began asking questions about their own sealed records, and not all of those answers were comfortable, and not all of those processes ended cleanly. But they began. 6 months after the chamber hearing, 3 more species formally submitted requests to review their own Accord histories. Then 4 more. Then 2 others. Humanity did not lead the Accord. It did not try to. It attended the sessions and voted its conscience and went home and argued with itself the way it always had, because humans were not a unified voice so much as a loud and complicated conversation that occasionally reached conclusions. But it remained what it had always been, the species that heard a signal from the dark and did not wait for permission before moving toward it, the species that counted the names of its dead and read them aloud in formal chambers until the room had no choice but to listen. The species that sat with a machine that had accidentally destroyed 4 civilizations and said, before asking it anything at all, "I thought you deserved to be spoken to properly." The galaxy held its breath for a little while. Then slowly, carefully, as galaxies do when something old and heavy has finally shifted, it learned to breathe differently.